Hi, everyone. We're just waiting for some more people to join, and then we'll get started. Jamila, if you could keep an eye on the waiting room, do you think you can, or not so much?
I'm not sure if I'm a co-host, but
Okay. Maybe I should make you a
yeah, if you
co-host.
make me a co-host, then I can.
Great. Oops, I accidentally gave that to someone else. Jamila. All right. Good. Cool. All right. As it's 1:02, we might just get started and allow others to trickle in as they do. So firstly, we're recording this event. I'm sure you get a notification when you jump in, but just wanted to let you know. So good afternoon and good morning. We have someone for which it is morning. And welcome to everyone from across Australia and the Pacific, as well as France. So thank you for choosing to join us today for this briefing on the intersections between climate change and nuclear weapons. My name is Jessie Boylan. I'm the Media and Comms Advisor with ICAN Australia. I've been involved in the anti-nuclear movement since 2005 when I first jumped on a bus into the South Australian outback with Friends of the Earth to learn about the impacts of uranium mining, nuclear testing, and radioactive waste proposals on First Nations communities, as well as the impacts of nuclear testing on veteran communities. I'm also an artist who addresses these issues in my work. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathering today from many different traditional lands and waterways. I live and work on Dja Dja Wurrung country in central Victoria, and I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the many different countries from which we all are gathered from today. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and First Nations people who are with us in this online space, and I'd pay my respects to elders past and present. In the words of Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang, decolonization is not a metaphor. It is an act and an ongoing process. And as Genevieve Greaves has said, it is a shared endeavor. So we know that environmental justice can't happen without First Nations justice, and we're here to discuss the ways in which nuclear weapons, climate change, and First Nations struggles intersect and how they must be fought together. So just to begin, for some housekeeping, if you haven't said so already, please use the chat and say where you're coming in from today, what country you're on, and where you're located. Please keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking. Use the chat to ask for clarification while someone is presenting. And also we'll have a Q&A at the end. So put your questions in there. And we really, really, really do want to hear from you, which is why we're all gathered here together. We want to hear about the work that you've done on these issues or what you would like to do, what ideas you have as we move through this discussion and what things come up. We're here because we know that much more work can be done and needs to be done to bring these issues together. And that's why we're calling this briefing. So this week marks 79 years since the devastating US nuclear attacks against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which killed more than 210,000 people, including some 38,000 babies and children. It is an incredibly somber but important reminder about the devastating impact of nuclear weapons on people and the planet. The threat posed by nuclear weapons today is higher than ever before. All 9 nuclear-armed nations are spending billions on modernizing their nuclear arsenals. with no meaningful attempts at disarmament in the last 2 decades. As the destructive potential of nuclear weapons is rising, so is the risk of irreversible tragedy through escalation of regional conflicts, misunderstanding, or pure human error. Thankfully, these abhorrent weapons are now clearly prohibited by the 2017 UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, which entered into force in 2021 and now has 93 signatories and 70 states parties. It is the first international agreement to comprehensively outlaw nuclear weapons and set out a pathway for the elimination of stockpiles in a time-bound, verifiable manner. It is a critical step in the long fight towards nuclear disarmament. The International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, is a coalition of non-governmental organisations in more than 100 countries promoting adherence and implementation of the TPNW. This landmark global agreement was adopted in New York on the 7th of July in 2017. ICAN has its humble origins in Victoria. We opened our first offices in Carlton in 2006. And in 2017, we received the Nobel Peace Prize for our work to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and groundbreaking efforts to achieve a treaty-based prohibition on such weapons. ICAN Australia is working to promote full adherence and full implementation of the TPNW, and we believe that while nuclear weapons are held and produced by nations across the world, catastrophic danger remains for all of us and our climate. We hope that by joining forces, we will continue the work in raising awareness about the environmental consequences of nuclear weapons and advocate for policies that protect both people and the environment. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, and we have 3 speakers today. Sadly, Apelli Lusoma was unable to join us today. So we've wonderfully had Jean-Marie Collin, who has stepped in from ICAN France in his place. We also have Tilman Ruff, AO, and Jamila Rushton from ICAN. So our first speaker is Dr. Tilman Ruff. He is a public health and infectious diseases physician. I'll just stop sharing. He's an Honourable Principal Fellow at the University of Melbourne. He was the co-president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which also won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. And he held that role from 2012 to 2023. He now serves on the board, and he is a co-founder of ICAN and a founding international and Australian chair of ICAN. So thank you, Tilman.
Thanks very much, Jessie. Let me launch straight into... Okay, I hope you can see that. So I'm going to talk about... sorry, I've just got a bit of clicking to do here to make this happy. Now, why isn't this advancing? About connections and consequences. And I really want to focus on 3 things. The first is that although most of us are probably not used to thinking about nuclear weapons as a climate issue, they most surely are. And the stable and hospitable climate we need for human and ecosphere flourishing really needs protecting both from uncontrolled heating, as we're all aware, but also from the abrupt onset of essentially ice age conditions that would be created by pretty much any nuclear war. There's other aspects that I'll leave to others to address. The second sort of nexus is that climate change clearly increases the risk of war and nuclear war in particular. And a third aspect that I'll just touch on is really that the claimed sort of solution to climate change that nuclear power is sometimes claimed to present really aggravates both the danger of nuclear war through creating and enabling the fissile materials that put the nuclear in nuclear weapons, and climate change. And I won't talk about that in detail, but leave that to others. But those are the three areas I'd like to touch on. My take home really about nuclear power is essentially the only reason it survives in this era is because of deep and strong vested interests, and because of interest in nuclear weapons on the part of states or even non-state actors. As Jesse has mentioned, it's a solemn period between the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the first use of nuclear weapons directly on cities in war, hopefully the last. I also just want to emphasize at the start just how profound is the current danger of nuclear weapons use. It really is at unprecedented levels. So there's a level of urgency about this that we really haven't had since at least the height of the Cold War. The doomsday clock stands at further forward than it's ever been before, at 90 seconds to midnight, largely but not solely for nuclear weapons related reasons. The UN Secretary General has repeatedly drawn attention to the extraordinary danger that we face, and the Cold War renewed that we're in, and the absolute imperative to get on with the disarmament. But instead, apart from the treaty that Jesse mentioned, there's really everything else is heading in the wrong direction. Hard-won treaties are being abandoned. There are no negotiations underway to replace them. All of the nuclear-armed states are massively investing in new weapons, faster, more stealthy, longer range, extraordinary sums, and expanding the number of countries that they station them in. We're also facing, for the first time, two nuclear-armed states directly involved in active wars, accompanied by nuclear threats with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, which also, for the first time, is targeting nuclear facilities in Ukraine in a profoundly disturbing and dangerous way that makes very sharp this nexus that we're talking about today. The Zaporizhzhia power plant is the largest in Europe and has been of central concern. It's been both a subject of attack as well as a site of military storage and attack. Its operations and safety and security have continually jeopardized, including extending to its ultimate cooling source, the Kakhovka Dam, which was breached last year. Extraordinary vulnerability. Recent studies suggest that even a small fraction of the inventory of one of those 6 nuclear reactors would essentially blanket Europe with radioactive contamination at dangerous levels. And also in the Israel-Palestine war, nuclear threats continue to accompany that catastrophe. The World Health Organization clearly said that nuclear weapons are the greatest immediate threat to health and welfare, and also unequivocally concluded that no effective response was possible. That we've known for a long time. What we haven't known, what's the important new science that underpins our understanding of nuclear weapons effects, is their climate impact. So how does that work? This would in fact be by far the largest source of casualties in a nuclear war. It's because nuclear weapons as incendiary devices are extraordinarily efficient at igniting over very large areas, essentially everything flammable that will burn. And even the relatively small tactical sized nuclear weapon used in Hiroshima released about 1,000 times as much energy from the fires that it started as the explosion itself. So in Hiroshima, about 13 square kilometers of the city comprehensively burned. If you put one of the largest deployed weapons today, 5 million tons of high explosive equivalent, on a city like Melbourne, where I am, about 1,600 square kilometers would comprehensively burn. Essentially nothing surviving within that zone. In Melbourne, that's about 46 kilometers in diameter, so out to Greenvale and Doncaster and nearly down to Frankston. virtually the whole of the greater urban area. The scenario that I'll show you is data from a relatively modest war in nuclear terms between India and Pakistan, using less than 3% of the global nuclear arsenal. A couple of hundred weapons of 50 kiloton size is the data that I'll focus on. So in nuclear war terms, localized in one region, relatively small. This is tiny in comparison to even one US ballistic missile carrying submarine or its Russian equivalent, which contains twice the combined arsenal of India, Pakistan, and Israel combined in one launch platform. So in nuclear war terms, what I'm showing you is relatively constrained and modest. Smoke generated by burning cities in South Asia would essentially blanket the globe within a matter of weeks and go very high and be stabilized by heating by the sun. So if you look at it as a cross section through the atmosphere, South Pole on the left, North Pole on the right, the equator in the middle, and up in the atmosphere on the vertical scale, this is where the smoke goes in, that yellow-orange patch. And you can see that really quickly it goes up really high. This is beyond the reach of clouds and rain and weather, beyond the tropopause down here. So it stays for a very long time, over a decade, is what all of the modeling is showing us. And let's focus on the black line, which is those 50 kiloton, sort of 3 times Hiroshima-sized weapons. Just the others are other scenarios. So this is years, this is rainfall, massive declines in global precipitation. This purple bar is the range of how much colder was it at the peak of the last ice age 20,000 years ago than now. It was between 3 and 8 degrees colder than present. And you can see that that modest scenario gets us down to well within that range over multiple years. This is global average surface temperatures. Those are, however, not evenly distributed, and the big land masses where most of the world's people live and most of the world's food is grown would be very much colder than that, 10 to 15 degrees plus colder in most of Eurasia and North America. So recently, groups in particularly the US have examined the impacts on every country of those kinds of smoke scenarios, colder, darker, drier under a persistent smoke cloud. What does that do in terms of food supplies and casualties? For various scenarios, let's focus on this one, and this is the middling one I showed you. So about 30 million tons of smoke in the atmosphere, about 100 million acute casualties, 14 times that number dead from starvation globally 2 years later. And a war using much of the Russian and US arsenals would starve to death most of humanity, billions, about 85% of the global population at least by the end of year 2, and the effects don't end then. Graphically shown, this is after the India-Pakistan scenario. You can see that in these dark red colors, over 75% and 90% respectively of the population starving to death by the end of year 2. And this is for a Russian-American scenario. So the scientists who've contributed this work, and these are conservative estimates, these just take account of colder, darker, drier, not all of the other losses of impact of inputs to agriculture, and loss of arable soil and farming equipment and supplies that underpin modern agriculture. So these are very conservative estimates. And the more we know, the worse it looks. And we constantly learn more that tends in the direction of greater effects. Previously undescribed ocean circulation changes, major changes in sea ice, and really significant changes in nutrient and current flows in the ocean that would dramatically diminish marine productivity. So the scientists who've done much of this work have really drawn the conclusion that these are not weapons in the sense that are usable and targetable. These are really global suicide bombs. Climate change aggravates the risk of war and nuclear escalation. This has been recognized by military and intelligence authorities around the world. This is from the Uppsala University Conflict database, one of the best and longest running in the world. And you can see that in the last decade or so, there's been a really significant increase in the number of armed conflicts globally, particularly in this category of intrastate conflicts that are internationalized, that involve an outside state, disproportionately the nuclear armed states, because they're the biggest militarily. And the casualties in those wars is also substantially escalating. So a climate-stressed world is a more dangerous place to have nuclear weapons. What about the stuff that puts the nuclear in nuclear weapons? Well, there are two pathways to produce the highly enriched uranium. At the front end of the nuclear chain, by enriching uranium in the uranium-235 isotope, that's one pathway to weapons. The other is to extract plutonium, which is inevitably produced inside any nuclear reactor from the uranium atoms absorbing neutrons. So front end or back end of the nuclear chain, if you're producing nuclear power, then you inevitably have the potential to produce the material for weapons. There are about 1,245 tons of highly enriched uranium and about 560 tons of separated plutonium in global civil and military stockpiles. You need a couple of kilograms of plutonium, or about 3 or 4 times as much highly enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon. So this translates to hundreds of thousands worth of nuclear weapons equivalents in fissile material already present. So controlling this material, ending its production, keeping it absolutely secure and eliminating it where possible is a central component of controlling nuclear dangers. And nuclear power exacerbates that problem. The history is also important. Nuclear power was essentially developed, promoted heavily in the 1950s, particularly by the United States, as a way of providing a benign cover for the massive Cold War increase in nuclear arsenals. And the historical documents are really quite clear about that. The purpose of promoting nuclear power was to enable nuclear weapons development and deployment. And that history applies to in Australia as well, where Australia's efforts where Australia's efforts to acquire nuclear weapons, why isn't this working? Sorry, I'm not sure what's going on here. Where Australia's efforts to acquire nuclear power were very clearly motivated by the desire to shorten the path to weapons. It's really clear in the history in every place. What happened in the Fukushima disaster, because of bad design and a large earthquake and tsunami, with a really complex and difficult radiological disaster resulting, could have equally happened by disruption to the constant cooling that the spent fuel ponds and the reactors need. There's great vulnerability of these facilities to military attack. Joseph Ortblat, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, showed 40 years ago now, how dramatically worse would be the consequences of a nuclear weapon if it were targeted on a reactor, or how dramatically worse a reactor accident could be if it was targeted by a nuclear weapon. So this is the 1 gray, a big radiation dose fallout contour for a 1 megaton nuclear weapon. This is the same fallout contour for such a weapon on an average sized nuclear power plant. And those isotopes inside a nuclear power plant, the reactors and the spent fuel, are much longer lived than those that result from a nuclear weapon. There have been state military attacks on nuclear facilities in the past. This is not a threshold that's never been crossed in Iraq and in Syria. And a recent paper, I don't take this as gospel, but I think it's a really interesting study looking at what are the most important drivers of marine and terrestrial animal extinction foreseeably at present, comparing sort of deforestation, pollution, climate disruption, and nuclear war, that clearly indicated that in this study, prevention of nuclear war was really the most potentially important contributor to those extinctions. So nuclear weapons could tragically make everything else that we strive for tragically irrelevant, and every species will be harmed in a nuclear war, but there's really only one that can stop it, and it's not the kangaroos. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tillman, for presenting that quite tricky and complex information so concisely and in a very short amount of time. It is very frightening stuff, and sometimes it feels really abstract. So it's really, really good to have it brought together. Our next speaker is Jean-Marie Collin, who is an expert in the fields of nuclear deterrence, disarmament, arms control, and nuclear non-proliferation, with particular expertise on French nuclear policy. He is associate researcher in the Group for Research and Information on Peace and Security, and he is also the director of ICAN France. Thank you so much, Jean-Marie, for waking up so early, and I believe it's only nearly 5:30 in the morning there, so we thank you so much for stepping in at late notice.
Thank you very much to me for these invitations. I'm going directly to the topics. So I'm not sure if I would give you enough information, but on this connection between climate change and nuclear weapons, but definitively I'm going to give you food for thought. The legacy of nuclear weapon testing continues to affect many communities, including the people of Maui Nui. And I would like to provide first a brief background on what happened in the former French nuclear test site in the Pacific. And then I will give you some information and thought on the link between climate change and nuclear weapons. So after United States, Russia, and United Kingdom, France has entered the nuclear arms race to obtain this system of weapons of mass destructions. Various French government had to carry out a total of 210 nuclear tests between 1960 to 1996. I'm going to change the wording and say 210 nuclear weapons explosions to make it clear that these tests were not simple tests in the scientific sense of the term. First in Algeria, a territory that was a French colony that later became independent, 17 nuclear tests carried out in the Sahara between 60 and 66. The environment and population are still subject to radioactive pollutions. Hazard of history, it seems that because of climate change, the south of France and even where I live here in Lyon, it's subject to much more frequent winds from the Sahara. The landscape is then covered, like in February, March, these last years, with an orange color. It's the sand of the Sahara, sand that is radioactive, fortunately, in a very small dosage, very infinite dosage. In Maui Nui, France conducted 193 nuclear tests from 1960 to 1996 at Moruroa and Fogatofa Atoll, including 41 atmospheric tests until 1974 that exposed the local population, seat workers, and French soldiers to high level of radiations. We know also now that nuclear fallout was detected through the Pacific regions. France conducting underground tests until 1991, following a brief moratorium, then renewed Pacific underground tests in 1995 to 1996. Despite France's claims to the contrary, underground nuclear weapon testing also posed threat to the people and environment to the Pacific regions. The test inflict extensive physical damage to the atoll of Moruroa, with ongoing risk of collapse and leakage. Radioactive, chemical, and other waste on land in lagoons and in the oceans remain both at the former testing sites. The nuclear tests generate very large quantities of radioactive materials, which remains inside the structures of the atoll. That thus characterize Moruroa and Fogatofa atolls as de facto nuclear waste stockpiles. I would like to focus on one event because what happened on this day, the 25th of July, 1979, is undoubtedly the most important environmental safety issue for Polynesians and more broadly for the people of Oceania today. This day of 1979, an underground nuclear test codenamed T-Day was realized. but because the 120 kiloton weapons got stuck at a depth of 400 meters and could not be dislodged, the explosion provoked major underwater landslides of at least 1 million cubic meters of coral and rocks and created a cavity, probably 140 meters in diameter. The underwater landslide produced a major tidal wave comparable to a tsunami, which spread through the Tuamotu archipelago and injured people on the southern part of Moruya. French authorities initially denied that any mischief had occurred and declared that the tidal wave was a natural origin. It took them 6 years before they revealed the truth. To quickly finish on the history, we know even if the transparency is far to be real, as shown in different French studies, the French dump a total of probably a minimum of 3,200 tons of nuclear waste in the close to Moruya and Ao Atoll between 72 to 1982, and they continue after to dump some non-radioactive waste until 85. This waste comes from the various series of tests realized, plus there is a total of 27 pits on Moruya Atoll, which contain a large quantity of plutonium and other radioactive waste from a depth of an average of 1,000 meters. Concerning the population, you must try and understand that the arrival of thousands and thousands of young soldiers from Europe in the early 60s was a revolution. Polynesian society, its culture, its way of life, everything was turned upside down in favor of a Franco-French culture. This explains why young Polynesians today find it hard to understand their origin, and climate change may also be an aggravating factor in the destruction of this culture. Of course, all this is sadly accompanied by a deep-seated feeling that Polynesia must submit to the military, to the soldiers, the new colonizer of the 20th century. Moruya Tattoo and Association 193 are the two main organizations with whom we work notably to obtain nuclear justice. It means helping them to obtain more transparency on the French nuclear compensation law, nuclear waste, and doing the nexus with environmental issues, notably by promoting the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which include two important goals: victim assistance and remediation of the environment. It's important to realize, that's my second part, that while these events took place between 60 and 40 years ago, the global topic has only just begun to come to light since the mid-2000s. For example, 1 year ago, journalists were able to provide new evidence, what we call the Moruya files, showing the extent of the radioactive fallout from certain atmospheric tests, demonstrating once again that France's word is far from transparent and honest on these topics. So you will understand, or at least you will have to accept, that in a publication dated in 2022 by the French Atomic Energy Commission, that they totally ignore the topic of the consequence of this explosion on climate change. This topic is described in just one paragraph. I guess you are not going to see because it's writing in green, but it's just in 2 lines here. So they just describe in one paragraph what happened in an event of flooding, that there is no risk of radionuclide trapped in underground cavities that could be released. What we know is that the rise of the level of the ocean level is real. On Iceland, such as Papino and Rangiroa, it's on north of Tahiti, according to an official Polynesian institutions, we can see that the retreat of the coastline is a reality and will continue and is problematic. And for proof that there is a climate change problem, President Macron, last 2 years ago, during his visit in Polynesia, confirmed that 17 new shelters need to be built to respond to the various effects of climate change. Already 27 exist. The situation on Moruya, the rise level of the ocean, is not transparent as you can imagine. Regarding the nuclear waste pits, it is in some way the same situation that you have in any Waitak atoll in the Marshall Islands. But in concrete terms, we don't know how climate change, by creating more typhoons and storms and varying the strength of the current, is going to have an impact on the stability of the Moruya atoll, and therefore on the risk of radioactive nuclei being released into the Pacific. Similarly, because of the accidents happened in '79, there is a possibility that part of this atoll could collapse. And that's a real possibility, and that's why the defense ministers realized since the 2000s put a system that should indicate whether the atoll is collapsing, and that giving them enough time to inform the population of Tureia. Well, when I say enough time, it's 10 minutes, okay? So it's not enough times. Tureia is located around 80 kilometers of Morulo. So what we can do now, France has 200 nuclear weapons, but above all, it has a radiological heritage and has a normally a responsible state. It must face up to this. The third thought that may come to mind is that we need to remove the nuclear waste. Unfortunately, and this is a real tragedy, this option is simply impossible for technical reasons. So we made all the time several recommendations. The first action is already to provide full transparency of the quantity of waste that have been dumped in the sea and buried. Full transparency is the key to building trust and respect, a value that has never been realized and given to the Polynesian population. The second action is to open the two atolls of Moruya and Whakatofa to independent scientific assessments, because the 1998 EREA studies need to be carried out again, because France has revealed new data over the last 20 years and scientists are analyzing the effect of climate change differently. We need new information. The third is to provide better protection for local populations, particularly those living on the atoll who could face a tsunami caused by the collapse of the Moruya atoll, and obviously by helping them better to have a nuclear justice in terms of the compensation. I can come back on the Q&A on that point. And finally, obviously, France must become a state party to the TPNW, the only treaty that has the capacity to act for the victim of nuclear testing and to initiate a process to rehabilitate the environment. Thank you to listen to me.
Thank you so much, Jean-Marie. It's very clear how nuclear colonialism has played out across the Pacific and all around the world, actually. So thank you so much for highlighting some of that in your presentation. We also have some people from the Pacific here who may wish to add some thoughts or information in the Q&A session, which would be really lovely to hear from you. So our next and final speaker before we open up for questions is Jamila Rushton. And Jamila is a campaigner with ICAN Australia, and she's been working with ICAN since 2019 and has a background as an organizer, networker, and community builder. Jamila has been working to address the interlinkages of militarism, extractivism, and colonialism for over a decade. Jamila represented ICAN Australia at the first meeting of states parties to the TPNW in Vienna in June 2023. Jamila holds a Bachelor of Arts in International Community Development from Victoria University in Naarm, Melbourne, and is based on the lands of the Pequorong speaking people of the shores of the Gunditjmara Southern Ocean Sea Country in Victoria. So thank you, Jamila.
Thank you, Jessie, and everyone. Big thanks to Tillman and Jean-Marie for providing some really amazing background information to bring us all up to speed on where things are at currently, and obviously the legacy of nuclear weapons testing in our region. Yeah, before I kick off, maybe I'll just also acknowledge the nuclear weapons testing that has happened across Australia, and that sort of shared experience that extends beyond borders of nuclear impacted communities and communities that have survived nuclear weapons testing. I did pop a thing in the chat that has a link to a broad range of stories from nuclear survivors that I thought you would find interesting. But yeah, certainly here in Australia, we come to this campaign with the understanding that nuclear weapons have already been tested and have already caused insurmountable damage to the climate and environment here through the testing at Montebello Islands, at Maralinga, and also at Emu Field. And it is my job today to address you all and hopefully inspire you to come together and turn this kind of devastating forecast around. Jessie gave a really great introduction to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at the beginning of this session. And it is our kind of focus here with the Australian campaign to ensure that Australia signs and ratifies this treaty, which would be the best possible contribution that we could make at this point to ensuring that Australia is not involved in any future nuclear war planning, and that can help bring down the risk of nuclear escalation worldwide, as well as start to offer some assistance and justice to communities that have survived nuclear weapons testing, because that is another really important part of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, is that it is the first of the nuclear international treaties on nuclear weapons that provides for justice for survivor communities. I would also, just like to acknowledge that there is a long history in spaces within the climate and environment movement in Australia, where people and movements have been identifying and drawing the intersections between the impacts of militarism and the climate, and that there is also a real resurgence of energy in this space, with a lot of new groups, new people taking on an interest and drawing these intersections together. Tillman mentioned the risks of nuclear attacks on nuclear facilities in Ukraine, and of course there is the devastating environmental and human costs that we have been witnessing in Gaza and many other conflicts around the world, where we're really seeing the environmental impacts of rapid escalation from military powers. So yeah, and I'm interested to hear from people here today who are working in these issues as to how we might kind of continue to work together around the nuclear dimension of these issues, particularly with the information that Tillman shared earlier on around the risks of a nuclear escalation and what that would mean for the climate and environment. So I guess just to give you a bit of an overview of where the campaign is at in Australia. So as Jessie mentioned, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is in force, but Australia has not signed this treaty yet. So that is our mission here in Australia in the campaign. And where we are with that at the moment is that we have in government is a party that has in their platform a commitment to sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in government. They have been in government for 2 years or so now and have yet to sign. So we know that our work is still cut out for us. It hasn't been the first priority on the new government's agenda. So that is something that we are also working towards, but it is very positive to have a commitment in their party platform, and that has been reaffirmed time and time again at the national level since it was first agreed in 2018. Most recently, it was agreed again and reaffirmed as a platform position in 2003. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has the support of at least 75% of the Labor caucus and federal level. Of course, the Greens are supportive, and many members of the crossbench. There's a really strong support within the Teals for this treaty. So it is something that has a lot of support within the Parliament, and of course has a lot of support within civil society from some of our partners on the call today, unions, medical associations. It's got a really broad support within the Australian public. All it needs is for the political will to take the step and sign the treaty and start to move forward with putting it into action. So that gives us a bit of a kind of overview of where the campaign is at in Australia. We would love to kind of break into a brief Q&A session. If there's any questions that have come through, perhaps we could revisit them. But I'm also really keen to hear what folks have, if there are any ideas of potential ways that we can work together to collaborate to kind of raise the agenda of this issue with the government at the moment. So I'll just maybe hand it back over to Jessie to field the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Jamila. That was very concise and clear about what Australia must do and has said they will do. So we're very much looking forward to that signature. I just was wondering, before we jump into the Q&A, if there was anyone from the Pacific who would like to speak or add to anything that has been brought up and addressed already. I won't put anyone in particular on the spot, but just if you wanted to, please feel free. We do have a question for Tillman from John Hallam, and that is how to best use the nuclear winter as a form of climate change and how to place that in a climate change global warming context when we'll be talking about global cooling and freezing.
Thanks for the
Tillman.
question. That's obviously a big and broad topic, but I think, it's hard to be alive and not be aware that global heating is happening with increasingly severe consequences. But I think too few people know that the other risk to the climate is of abrupt ice age cooling from nuclear war. And I think those are really useful to link because it, essentially we have to protect and preserve and a healthy planet for all of us, and that we need to do whatever it takes at the same time, unfortunately. And I think we can always do that more effectively by working in coalitions and by building connections between issues and by supporting related struggles and advocacy efforts. That's really vital. We're so much more effective together, and that was the whole premise for ICAN, to try and deal both people whose core business is nuclear peace and nuclear disarmament, but also people for whom it isn't core business, but for whom it clearly at times is part of their business, trade unions, churches, many other associations. And I think, organizations like Greenpeace were born with that very strong link, the green and the peace. But I think collectively, the sort of a wider environment movement as it's currently understood hasn't quite, we've failed in keeping that connection really strong. And I think it's absolutely vital that we do that. So I'm really delighted to continue this conversation, but I don't think there's a simple answer. But I think, clearly education and information and making connections and working together is the way to go. There's now, for example, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War is really engaged in the connection with climate in a much stronger way and is sending teams of people to COP meetings now. That's one obvious way that the peace movement needs to do more to engage with climate and the connections, but connections are needed all around. Thanks.
Thanks, Tillman. Jamie has a question from Climate Justice Union in WA. If you want to ask your question.
Hey, everyone. Thanks. My name's Jamie. I love being called Jem, though. Thank you very much. I'm working with folks on the ground in Collie around the stupid nuclear proposal for nuclear energy, but I also live in Kwinana near Rockingham. So, oh, look, that's me, very large. Hang on, let me just remove the spotlight for me. Sorry, I was a bit surprised to see myself so large. I'm also, I live and work in Kwinana and Rockingham. So I'm near Garden Island, where they're currently proposing a nuclear waste facility and where we'll be apparently hosting nuclear subs. So I'm working directly with community members that are really active around this and interested in what they can do. My question is, Jamila, you were asking around ways of putting pressure on the government. There's something bouncing around in my head around, is there a strategic opportunity that they sign the agreement before the election to scupper Dutton's plans in some way? But I know that when Dutton and others are talking about the nuclear energy, they keep linking it to AUKUS and the need for a nuclear waste facility. And I know, obviously, Labor are backing AUKUS in. So I'm curious around all of those pieces, and whether you see a strategic, or others see a strategic opportunity in that, and there's things that we can be mindful. We also have really great relationships with some union crew over here as well, and I know Mia and others are doing that work already. But so it's not a very clear question, but it's a bunch of kind of bumbling thoughts that are bouncing around, and I'm just wondering if anyone has any clarity.
Thank you, Jamie. I can continue to call you Jem if you like. Does anyone want to respond to that? Tillman, Jamila in particular?
I'm happy to make a couple of, yeah, you go first, Jamila, go.
I would say that's so great that there's already some solid organising happening around this, and I think that, yeah, there's some other questions around AUKUS in here as well, which I might leave to Tillman to answer. But certainly I'll just maybe start by this and then pass to Tillman, that we have always said that the best way that Australia could signify that they are not going to acquire nuclear weapons, or that AUKUS will not progress into submarines that carry nuclear weapons, is by signing the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That has been very clear from the second that AUKUS has been proposed, that has been ICAN Australia's position. And there is, around the kind of timelining of signing in a first term, we have been pushing for signature as soon as that new government was introduced and brought in 2 years ago. I feel like there is, yeah, feels tricky to think about signature before the end of the first term, especially as it feels like there are, various machinations entering into election mode, and the cautiousness which parties approach these kind of issues around national security in the lead up to an election. But that is absolutely no reason for us to stop pushing for it and demanding a signature as soon as possible. We have always said without delay is the best way to be signing this treaty, and that a ratification process, which is kind of enacting it into our Australian laws, can happen over a number of years after the treaty has been signed. So maybe I'll start with that, and then maybe I can pass to Tillman for some of those other points, and then potentially there was a question around AUKUS, so maybe I can pass that to you as well.
Sure, thanks, Jamie. Yeah, I hope I understood your sort of complex, sort of wide-ranging question, but I'll just make a couple of comments that I hope are useful. But ICAN's comments on, or involvement on AUKUS, is obviously related to our, fairly narrow mandate around weapons and war. We've not been shy about our profound concerns about the whole nuclear submarine acquisition plan. We see it as dangerously increasing Australia's complicity in nuclear weapons dangers, and particularly increasing the risk of armed conflict and nuclear escalation, especially with China in our region. The other dimension that we've not been shy to comment on is, or one other dimension is, there are so many bad things about AUKUS, it's hard to know where to start and stop. I mean, it's just appalling from every point of view, cost and sovereignty and all sorts of things. But the other aspect that's been crucial for us has been that US and UK submarines, and almost certainly any new AUKUS submarines, will be powered by highly enriched uranium. That's directly weapons usable. So you're talking about between 6 and 20 nuclear weapons worth of material per submarine. It would be the first occasion where a state had exploited a previously dormant loophole in the Non-Proliferation Treaty to take very large amounts of nuclear material out of safeguards. It's essentially unsafeguardable because you've got large quantities on a stealth platform where the whole idea is that it's in the deep ocean where nobody knows where it is for many months at a time. and the waste from those reactors is still highly enriched uranium that's still weapons usable. So there's a particular nuclear weapons dimension here that's really concerning. And as Jamila said, and I think it's really important, if the Australian government is really serious, as they repeatedly say, that nuclear powered submarines are not the thin end of the wedge for nuclear weapons being stationed here, delivered NATO style by Australian forces, or heaven forbid, acquired by Australia, then by far the most enduring and effective way to bind not just this government, but potential future governments, is to join the TPNW. Unfortunately, that argument was rejected by the Prime Minister when we specifically put it to him and Penny Wong. But it has got a lot of traction and a lot of nods from most Labor people we talk to. So we think it's a really important argument to put. And if Labor wants to differentiate itself from this extraordinarily irresponsible and divisive sort of wedge politics that the coalition is trying to play around nuclear issues, then distinguishing its difference on nuclear power, but also on nuclear weapons, would be a consistent and decent way to present a clear alternative. So I think while not in any way sanctioning or supporting or acquiescing to the AUKUS nuclear submarine plan, that's a specific dimension that's really clearly in our shop, and that would at least draw a firm barrier between whatever else they end up doing and weapons. Thanks.
Thanks, Tillman. There's a couple more questions. We are getting dangerously close to 2 o'clock. I'll just reiterate that we will do a recap of questions and links and our presentations that we can share around to everyone who's registered after this event, including anything that's brought up about ways forward, and anything that you'd like to add to that, please send it through to me so I can add it to the document. I just wanted to ask Olivia Barrow from the Pacific Council of Churches to speak in regards to the work that you're doing, if that's all right, just before we end.
Thank you, Joseph, for the opportunity. I know we are pressed for time, and thank you for having me to speak this afternoon. Just something I would like to add, by emphasizing the widely recognized but often overlooked injustice of nuclear testing in the Pacific, the issue that is deeply embedded scars in the history of our region. The 350 nuclear bombs were tested over 40 years in Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Maui, and Australia from around 1946 and 1966 that we've heard this afternoon. And to note that French were still detonating nuclear bombs on under Mururua when some individuals were born in 1996. This poignant detail speaks to the ongoing nature of injustice extending beyond historical narratives and impacting individuals born in a world that should have been moved beyond such egregious practices. The intergenerational impact of nuclear testing on the Pacific nations, stressing the lingering consequences in health, compensation, environmental degradation, displacement, and educational challenges. The historical decisions surrounding nuclear activities were shown to have far-fetching effects on current and future. And one that we link into the conversation today is the Japan's 30-year dumping plan, pressing issue of nuclear waste, particularly around Japan dumping nuclear waste into the Pacific in the next 30 years. And the call for nuclear abolitions through the moral responsibility of international community to ensure a nuclear free and future, and the call for treaty to ban nuclear weapons. And that is always a call from all young and promising activists calling for a ban on nuclear weapons. And I hope that we will never repeat the history that has happened around the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivia, for adding that in there. It's so important to hear from First Nations communities and survivor communities, and our work can't be done without those voices. And actually, it's First Nations communities and the victims and survivors of nuclear weapons testing and nuclear bombs, like those Hibakusha in Japan, who are actually leading the peace and disarmament movement and also the climate justice movement. So we'll have to end being 2:01 p.m. I know we could have this discussion for much longer, but please, we would love to continue this dialogue. And it's so wonderful to see so many people come together to talk about these interlinking issues and to begin this conversation on how we can further our work together. And please, yeah, send through any further ideas, and we will also like I said, recap on what's been discussed here and send out Tillman's updated paper on climate change and nuclear weapons with that recap as well. So many, many thanks to everyone who's come today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and also honouring the victims of the 79th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki this week. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.